For privacy reasons, names and locations have been changed. This story is inspired by true events.
In the summer of 2012, Rafael Mendez and Yelena Cruz vanished without a trace in the Appalachian foothills. Their truck was found abandoned at a trailhead, belongings still inside, but the couple had disappeared into silence. 5 years later, Rafael's remains were uncovered in a forgotten storm shelter, murdered, his body hidden long after his death. Yelena was nowhere to be found. Then, in 2018, a grainy photograph surfaced from Havana, Cuba. A woman who looked exactly like her. Was Yelena a victim, a fugitive, or Rafael's killer? The truth remains buried in the mountains. The story of Rafael Mendez and Yelena Cruz begins far from the storm shelter where his bones would one day be found. Rafael, 44, was a man shaped by the rugged Appalachian hills that raised him. He had worked construction and logging jobs his whole life, his hands roughened by labor, his back bowed by years of carrying more than his share. To neighbors he was quiet, sometimes brooding, the sort who preferred silence to conversation, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. Yelena, in contrast, was born in Havana and had come to the United States in her 20s, with dreams that seemed larger than the small town she found herself in. At 33, she was still chasing them, filling sketchbooks with drawings of trees, rivers, and the mountains that both captivated and confined her. Those who knew them together often remarked on the odd pairing, Rafael rooted like an oak, and Yelena restless like a bird always looking for the sky. To some, their union looked like balance. To others, it seemed like a collision waiting to happen. Their lives together were complicated by both love and conflict. Family members recalled visits where the couple seemed affectionate, laughing over meals, planning hiking trips. But neighbors told another story, one of arguments heard through open windows, voices raised in anger, then abruptly silenced. One neighbor remembered a night when Rafael stormed out of their cabin, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled, while Yelena stood in the yard shouting words no one could quite make out. In those moments, the Appalachian quiet seemed to swallow their troubles, but the tension was real. By the summer of 2012, Yelena's sketchbook showed darker drawings, storms over mountains, twisted trees, eyes peering out from shadows. Whether they were art or confessions, no one would ever know. In July of that year, Rafael and Yelena vanished. Their truck was found parked neatly at the head of a popular hiking trail, doors locked, keys missing. Inside were Rafael's well-worn hunting knife, a thermos, and Yelena's sketchbook filled with half-finished drawings. Oddly, several unopened water bottles sat on the back seat, as if they had prepared for a hike but never taken it. Search parties combed the trails, their dogs picking up scents that ended abruptly at a fire road, as if the couple had stepped into the trees and disappeared. Volunteers found no footprints, no scraps of clothing, nothing but silence. That same week, a nearby hunting cabin was reported broken into, food missing, a lantern gone, but no one could tie it directly to Rafael or Yelena. Law enforcement, with no evidence of foul play, leaned on a simple explanation. Perhaps the couple had chosen to run, to disappear together. It wasn't unheard of for people burdened by debt, strained relationships, or restless hearts to vanish into new lives. With no bodies, no credit card activity, and no cries for help, the case slowly sank into the category of voluntary disappearance. For their families, however, the void was unbearable. Rafael's sister held vigils near the trailhead, placing candles and flowers beneath the trees. Yelena's mother called from Miami again and again, pleading with detectives not to give up, insisting her daughter would never abandon her. But as the months turned into years, the mountain kept its secret, and the world moved on. By 2017, the story of Rafael and Yelena was little more than a whisper in local memory. 5 years after Rafael and Yelena vanished without a trace, the mystery roared back to life in the most chilling way imaginable. It was late autumn of 2017 when a hunter exploring a remote section of the Appalachian foothills stumbled upon a crumbling Cold War-era storm shelter hidden under a tangle of vines and brush. At first glance, it seemed like little more than a relic of paranoia, its steel hatch rusted and its walls damp with decades of neglect. But inside, lying in the darkness where no light had touched for years, were human remains. The hunter, horrified, called authorities, and soon the shelter was swarming with investigators who carefully extracted the skeletal bones and carried them out into the gray daylight. Dental records confirmed what many had feared, but also long forgotten. The remains belonged to Rafael Mendez. The discovery reignited a case once thought dead, and with it came more questions than answers. Forensic analysis showed Rafael had died from blunt force trauma to the skull, a brutal end that pointed not to accident, but to murder. Even more disturbing, experts determined his body had not been placed in the shelter back in 2012 when he first disappeared, but rather relocated there years later, around 2016, suggesting someone had returned to hide him long after the world assumed the couple was gone. Scattered around the shelter were strange items: cigarette butts, beer cans, and food wrappers dated well beyond Rafael's disappearance, belonging to someone else entirely. DNA lifted from the items did not match Rafael or Yelena, instead belonging to an unidentified third party. This chilling revelation deepened the puzzle. Who had been in that shelter, and what role had they played in Rafael's fate? Meanwhile, Yelena was nowhere to be found. No trace of her body, no personal belongings, no DNA evidence surfaced in or around the shelter. To Rafael's family, the absence was damning proof that Yelena had killed him and fled, perhaps to start a new life away from the mountains she despised. But to Yelena's mother and friends, it suggested something darker, that Yelena herself had been a victim, her body hidden somewhere the mountains had yet to reveal. Law enforcement, pressured by the shocking discovery, reopened the case in full force. Reporters swarmed the town, locals whispered about the cursed storm shelter, and amateur sleuths flocked to online forums to dissect every piece of evidence. Yet for all the noise, the silence at the heart of the case remained deafening. The single body confirmed what everyone had feared: foul play was involved. But the missing woman, the relocated remains, and the presence of an unknown third person made the truth even more elusive. For investigators, it was as though the mountains had teased them with one cruel clue, only to swallow the rest of the story whole. By 2019, public pressure and the growing circus around the storm shelter discovery pushed prosecutors into a corner. And they made a bold move, charging Yelena Cruz in absentia with the murder of Rafael Mendez. It was an extraordinary step, given that Yelena herself was still missing and had not been seen definitively since 2012. But for Rafael's grieving family, it felt like long overdue justice. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence: the blunt force trauma to Rafael's skull, the body being relocated years later, and the infamous Havana Cafe photograph from 2018, which appeared to show Yelena sitting with friends in Cuba. Though blurry and grainy, the image became the centerpiece of the state's narrative. Yelena was alive, living free, while Rafael lay rotting in the ground. Prosecutors painted her as a restless woman, desperate to escape her controlling Appalachian life, suggesting she struck Rafael down during one of their escalating fights and fled to her homeland. The courtroom was tense, a theater of grief and accusation. Rafael's sister, eyes red with rage, testified that she had always distrusted Yelena, recalling bruises on Rafael's arms and his quiet complaints that Yelena wanted more than he could give. On the other side sat Yelena's mother, flown in from Miami, clutching a rosary and insisting through tears that her daughter was a victim too. a young woman who had called her in fear weeks before disappearing, whispering that Raphael's temper was getting worse. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on the unidentified third-party DNA found in the shelter. How could Yelena be solely responsible when another person had clearly been present, possibly the true killer? They argued that without her testimony, without a clear chain of evidence, the state's case was built on speculation and grief, not proof. The Havana photo, they pointed out, could just as easily be mistaken identity, a cruel coincidence blown into certainty by desperation. As testimony unfolded, the courtroom became a stage for raw emotion. Family members breaking down on the stand, investigators admitting the frustrating holes in their case, experts clashing over timelines and decomposition science. The jury, caught between two families' competing narratives, wrestled with the question: was Yelena a cold-blooded killer, or another missing victim swallowed by the same darkness that claimed Raphael? After weeks of heated arguments and endless media coverage, the trial collapsed under its own weight. The judge, citing insufficient evidence and the absence of the accused, declared a mistrial. No conviction, no closure. As Raphael's sister sobbed in disbelief and Yelena's mother whispered prayers for her missing daughter, the case slid back into limbo, leaving the truth suspended between accusation and absence. For the public, the mistrial was infuriating. For investigators, it was a reminder of how fragile justice can be when ghosts, not witnesses, dominate the evidence. In the aftermath of the mistrial, the case of Rafael Mendez and Yelena Cruz spiraled into something larger than the courtroom could contain, evolving into a haunting puzzle that consumed investigators, families, and the public alike. The FBI Cold Case Unit re-examined the storm shelter in 2019, convinced that somewhere within its damp walls and rotted timbers lay a piece of the truth they had overlooked. Using new forensic methods, they discovered fibers from an unfamiliar fabric and reanalyzed the cigarette butts and beer cans, confirming once again the presence of a third, unidentified person at the site, a stranger whose DNA remained unmatched in criminal databases. This revelation reignited speculation. Had Yelena and Raphael encountered someone dangerous in the mountains? Someone who killed him and perhaps kept her alive? Or worse? Meanwhile, private investigators hired by Raphael's family latched on to the Havana sighting, claiming to trace Yelena through whispers of aliases used across the Caribbean. In one sensational twist, a Miami-based informant insisted Yelena had been living under a false name working in a nightclub in Cancun. When police checked, the woman was real, but she was not Yelena. Each dead end deepened the divide between the families. Raphael's sister became a vocal figure in the media, giving tearful interviews where she accused Yelena of being a manipulative liar who had stolen her brother's life and freedom, her anger hardening into certainty that the missing woman was guilty. In stark contrast, Yelena's mother walked the streets of Havana with homemade flyers, begging strangers to look at her daughter's photograph, pleading with television crews to remember that Yelena might also have been a victim. The emotional tug-of-war played out on national news, turning the case into a battle of narratives as much as a criminal investigation. Online, true crime communities tore the story apart, analyzing every detail: the placement of Raphael's body, the timing of the relocation, the disputed Havana photograph, even the sketchbook Yelena had left behind in the truck. Some theorists claimed Yelena had been killed alongside Raphael, her body hidden in some remote cave. Others believed she had staged the entire disappearance, orchestrating an escape that took years to unravel. Investigators admitted their frustration, with one detective telling reporters, "It's like chasing a ghost. Every lead fades into smoke." By 2021, the case had become a cold obsession. with little progress made and mounting bitterness between those who demanded justice and those who longed only for answers. The storm shelter, once a forgotten relic of the Cold War, had become a grim symbol of the mystery, a place where one man's life ended, another's fate began, and the line between victim and killer blurred beyond recognition. By 2021, nearly a decade after Rafael Mendez and Yelena Cruz first vanished into the Appalachian wilderness, the case had transformed into something larger than a crime story. It had become a cultural obsession, a wound that refused to heal, a riddle echoing through families, communities, and internet forums across the world. That spring, Rafael's remains were reburied in a quiet cemetery near his childhood home, his grave marked by a simple headstone that read only his name and the dates of his birth and death, the years between left blank in their ambiguity. His sister, still defiant, stood over the coffin as the soil was shoveled in, vowing before cameras and mourners that she would never stop fighting to prove Yelena's guilt, never allow her brother's memory to be clouded by uncertainty. Yelena's mother, excluded from the service, watched from a distance and later held her own vigil in Miami, placing a framed photograph of her daughter beside a candle and whispering through tears that one day she would come home. The tension between the families had hardened into bitterness, and each saw the other not as fellow victims of tragedy, but as enemies, guardians of opposing truths. The FBI, having exhausted their immediate leads, quietly reclassified Yelena from fugitive wanted for questioning to missing person of interest, a bureaucratic adjustment that enraged Rafael's relatives, who viewed it as the government abandoning their fight, while offering a sliver of hope to Yelena's family, who clung desperately to the possibility she was alive and blameless. For investigators, the case sat in a purgatory of unanswered questions. The storm shelter remained the central artifact, its rusting hatch now welded shut, its interior stripped of every piece of evidence, yet still heavy with the memory of what had been found there. Detectives revisited the old trailhead, where the truck was discovered in 2012, interviewing hikers who swore they had seen a man and woman matching Rafael and Yelena's descriptions in the weeks before they disappeared, but none of the accounts were consistent enough to stand as fact. Some claimed Yelena looked scared, others insisted she appeared carefree, sketchbook in hand. There were whispers that Rafael owed money to a dangerous drifter known only as Cole, a man seen drinking at mountain bars in that summer of 2012 before vanishing himself, but no record of him could be traced beyond rumor. Theories multiplied, that Rafael had been ambushed and killed, that Yelena had struck the fatal blow in desperation, that both had been victims of an opportunistic stranger who later disposed of Rafael's remains and took Yelena with him. Each theory carried its own logic, its own holes, and none could be proven. In 2022, a new wave of attention surged when a podcast devoted to unsolved mysteries released a 6-part series on the case, reigniting public interest and drawing amateur sleuths into the fray. The podcast dissected every piece of evidence: the blunt force trauma, the relocated body, the timeline of decomposition, the contested Havana photograph, the unidentified DNA in the shelter, while interviewing surviving family members, whose voices cracked with grief and anger. Listeners flooded online forums with speculation, some convinced Yelena was living under a new identity in Central America, others certain she was long dead, her bones lying undiscovered somewhere in the endless Appalachian forests. Rafael's sister became a recurring guest on news panels, repeating her conviction that Yelena had orchestrated her brother's murder, while Yelena's mother continued her quiet campaign in Havana, handing out flyers with her daughter's image and pleading with strangers, "If you see her, tell her she is not alone." That same year, the FBI announced that the unidentified DNA from the shelter did not match any entry in CODIS or international databases, deepening the mystery and leading to speculation that the third person was either a local, never arrested, or a traveler passing through who had disappeared as completely as Yelena herself. Despite renewed efforts, every new lead fizzled into silence. By 2023, the case had entered a new kind of afterlife, not forgotten, but suspended, sustained by the endless churn of documentaries, podcasts, and online theories. The storm shelter itself became a grim tourist site, hikers posting photos of its rusted hatch online with captions about ghosts and curses, while locals muttered that the land had always been strange, a place where secrets fester. For the families, however, there was no romance in the mystery, only pain that deepened with every passing year. Raphael's sister grew bitter, convinced justice had been stolen from her, while Yelena's mother aged visibly under the weight of uncertainty, her health failing as she waited for a daughter who might never return. Law enforcement admitted privately that unless Yelena surfaced alive or her remains were found, the truth of what happened in those mountains might never be known. Yet the story refused to fade. In 2024, another blurry photograph circulated online, this one purportedly showing Yelena in a market in Mexico City, but investigators dismissed it as a case of mistaken identity. Still, hope and suspicion flared once more, each side seizing on the image as proof of their version of the truth. By 2025, 13 years after the couple disappeared and 8 years after Raphael's body was recovered, the case remains officially unsolved, a cold file gathering dust in state archives, but alive in the minds of those who cannot let go. Theories still swirl. Perhaps Yelena struck her husband in desperation and fled. Perhaps she was kidnapped by the same mysterious third party who dumped Raphael's remains in that shelter. Or perhaps the Havana sighting was real, and she is out there still, living quietly under another name, carrying the burden of a secret that could shatter two families forever. What endures is the silence of the mountains, a silence that has swallowed countless lives before and will do so again. In the Appalachian foothills, the trees still stand where Raphael and Yelena once walked, the trails wind on past the place their truck was found, and the abandoned shelter sits as a rusted tomb of unanswered questions. For the families, justice is an open wound. For Yelena's family, hope is both salvation and torment. For the rest of us, the case is a chilling reminder that sometimes the truth does not reveal itself, that the line between victim and perpetrator can blur until no one knows which is which. As the narrator's voice would close in a documentary over the final images of Raphael's smiling portrait beside the blurred Havana Cafe photo, did Yelena kill Raphael and escape into the night, or was she swallowed by the same darkness that claimed him? Until she is found, alive or dead, the truth remains buried in the mountains.